Done.
What about the defense you guys played on Caitlin Clark today? You under 4-15 shooting.
Well, we
Here's
wanted
the
to get
part
it
that
out.
should make Indiana Fever fans stop and really think. The Dallas Wings, yes, the same team that just beat the Fever, had their head coach sit down at the podium and give Caitlin Clark more direct, specific respect in about 15 seconds than her own head coach has managed to give publicly across nearly 2 full seasons. At the exact same time, over in Indiana, Stephanie White keeps showing up in these very public moments where she seems determined to micromanage the very player the rest of the league is openly game planning around. And that contrast is the entire reason for this video. On one side, you have a rival coach talking about Clark like she is the central emergency his staff had to solve on every possession. On the other side, you have Clark's own coach repeatedly treating her like she needs constant live correction just to survive a regular stretch of game action. That difference matters, because coaches reveal what they truly believe in 2 places, the game plan and the body language. And right now, those 2 things are telling completely different stories depending on which bench you're looking at. So let's start with Dallas, because this part should genuinely bother Fever fans once they hear the full quote and really process what it means. This wasn't just some polite post-game compliment. This wasn't an opposing coach being generous for the cameras or trying to sound classy after a nationally discussed matchup. This was a coach explaining, in plain language, how much respect his staff had for Clark before the opening tip even happened. That's what makes it so striking. Rival coaches are usually careful. They hide behind generalities. They talk about team effort, defensive discipline, communication, and staying connected. They almost never hand one player that kind of spotlight unless that player completely wrecked the game. But in this case, Clark didn't need to score 35 for Dallas to make the point. She only needed to exist. Her presence alone shaped the entire defensive strategy. That's the kind of fear only the best players create. And when you compare that to what Clark keeps getting from her own sideline, live criticism, visible tension, and public second-guessing, it becomes hard not to notice the gap. One coach saw a basketball problem so dangerous he had to solve it in advance. The other keeps acting like the problem is the player herself.
What about the defense you guys played on Caitlin Clark today? You under 4-15 shooting.
Well, we wanted to get it out of her hands.
After Thursday's game, Wings head coach Jose Fernandez was asked directly about the defense his team used against Clark. And instead of giving the usual foggy coach speak, where everything gets buried under cliches about collective effort and staying locked in, he just said exactly what they were trying to do. He said, "Well, we wanted to get it out of her hands in a pick-and-roll situation in the middle of the floor. She's so good. So if it was going to be on the side of the floor, we wanted to get it out of her hands and make other people make shots." That is not some throwaway compliment. That is not the kind of line a coach tosses out because he wants to be respectful in front of reporters. That is a full defensive blueprint, stated out loud, on the record, with zero hesitation. He told you exactly where his staff feared Clark most, exactly what action they wanted to disrupt, and exactly how far they were willing to go to force the ball away from her. Think about what that means. That means Dallas sat in film sessions before this game and made a deliberate choice. If Clark gets comfortable operating in the middle of the floor, especially in pick and roll, the whole defense is in danger. That's not how teams talk about average guards. That's not how coaches prepare for some overhyped rookie still living off media buzz. That is the language reserved for elite offensive engines, the few players in any league who can collapse a defense, trigger rotations, and bend the geometry of the floor just by touching the ball in the right spot. And Fernandez didn't even try to disguise it. He basically admitted that the priority was not guard Indiana. The priority was get the ball out of Clark's hands and live with whatever happens next. That is a completely different level of respect. It tells you that, in his mind, Clark is the system trigger. She's the player who forces every weak side defender to think twice, every big to step up a half second earlier, every guard to panic about screens and angles before the action even develops. People online can argue all day about turnovers, efficiency, hype, or whether she gets too much attention. Fine. But opposing coaches don't build entire plans around social media narratives. They build them around what actually scares them on film. And what Dallas saw on film was simple. If you let Caitlin Clark play
one of the rare games where she just didn't seem to impact the game at all.
What makes Fernandez's quote hit even harder is that Dallas said all of this after a win. This was not a coach trying to soften a painful loss by praising the player who just embarrassed his team on national television. This was not damage control after Clark exploded for 40 and left the arena with all the headlines. Dallas won the game. Clark was held to 5 points on 2-for-7 shooting in 18 minutes, and the Fever had to rely on adjustments and role-player scoring to stabilize the offense. So when Fernandez spoke afterward, he wasn't flattering Clark out of politeness. He was explaining exactly how his team survived her. That matters, because praise after a loss can sometimes sound emotional or reactive. Praise after a win, especially specific praise tied to tactical decisions, is something else entirely. That's a coach telling the truth. He was essentially saying, yes, we beat them. And yes, the reason we felt we had to coach this game the way we did is because that player is dangerous enough to force it. That is a huge statement. It means Clark's impact is so real that even when the box score doesn't explode, the defensive paranoia remains exactly the same. The respect does not disappear just because the stat line looks modest. And this is the part that cuts through all the noise surrounding her. You can hear endless commentary about whether she turns the ball over too much, whether stronger guards bother her physically, whether she's already the best point guard in the league, or whether people have crowned her too fast. But an opposing head coach, someone with absolutely no incentive to inflate her status after beating her, looked right into a microphone and said the quiet part out loud. We built our entire defensive plan around stopping her first. That's not PR. That's not fan fiction. That's basketball truth from the other bench. And once you understand that, everything else looks different. The turnovers? Partly a product of how aggressively teams load up on her. The physical pressure? A sign of how urgently opponents want to disrupt her rhythm. The obsession with forcing the ball out of her hands? Proof that the league already sees her as the head of the snake. That's why the Dallas quote lands the way it does. It confirms what people watching closely have been seeing for months. Caitlin Clark is not being treated like
either she gotta go or Caitlin gotta go. Because we don't know what Stephanie White on. Y'all do realize the starters only had like 11
Now
possessions.
flip the camera over to Indiana, because this is where the contrast becomes impossible to miss. Back in late May, during a blowout loss to Portland, cameras caught a tense exchange between Stephanie White and Clark during a timeout with 8:26 left in the second quarter. Indiana was already down 18. White looked upset about something from the previous possession, said what she needed to say, and then, right in the middle of that exchange, pulled Clark from the game and sent in rookie guard Raven Johnson. Clark's reaction told its own story. Arms up. Visible frustration. That unmistakable "are you serious right now?" body language that no press conference can fully erase afterward. She stood near the bench, drinking water, while White turned right back to the rest of the group as if nothing especially notable had just happened. But everyone watching knew something had happened, because these moments do not go viral by accident. People can feel tension when it's real. And what makes the clip even more revealing is the reported substance of the disagreement. This wasn't some childish outburst over touches or a selfish complaint about not getting shots. By Clark's own explanation afterward, she believed the foul sequence against her was being called incorrectly and wanted White to challenge it. She was saying, in essence, I didn't touch anybody. Go look at it. Challenge the call. That's not a player checking out mentally. That's a competitor fighting to affect the game while her team is getting run off the floor. Instead, the moment escalated into a public benching. And once that happens in front of cameras, the symbolism gets bigger than the possession itself. Because when your best player disagrees with you in a high-pressure moment and your immediate answer is to remove her from the game, it doesn't read like calm leadership. It reads like control. White later framed it as coaching Clark to a higher level, and in theory, every coach has the right to push stars hard. But there is a difference between demanding accountability and making a point. This looked a lot more like the second one. It looked like a power move wrapped in the language of tough love. That's the issue. Great players need structure, absolutely. But they also need trust. And when the most visible moments between coach and star keep ending in public frustration.
To see these moments play out so virally like that.
As far as we were concerned, the moment died right there. It's just, we can't control, the outside narrative.
2 days later, both Clark and White tried to calm everything down in front of the media. White described their relationship as fantastic. Clark said fans and reporters had blown the entire situation out of proportion and framed it as nothing more than two competitive people trying to win a game. And sure, maybe some part of that is true. Maybe it really was one heated moment magnified by cameras and internet repetition. But here's the problem with that cleanup. Body language on the court is immediate, unscripted, and difficult to fake. Post-game messaging 2 days later is the exact opposite. By then, everyone has had time to workshop the answer, trim the edges, and decide what version of the story should be sold publicly. So even if the official explanation contains truth, it doesn't erase what people already saw with their own eyes. And this is why so many fans refused to treat that Portland clip like a one-off. Because it didn't feel isolated. It felt familiar. It fit a pattern that had already started forming. There was another moment earlier that month, ahead of a major matchup with the New York Liberty, when White reportedly delivered a pointed pre-game message that fans immediately interpreted as being aimed at Clark. Whether it actually was or wasn't personal almost became irrelevant, because the perception took off fast enough that Clark and teammate Sophie Cunningham later felt the need to respond publicly and make it clear the speech should not be read as a direct shot. That alone tells you how sensitive the optics had already become. When fans are so primed to read tension into a coach's words that the star player and a teammate end up doing media repair afterward, something deeper is clearly going on in the public mind. Then Clark went out and torched the Liberty in a historic performance, which only fed the narrative even more. Suddenly the sequence looked familiar again. Friction appears, Clark responds by producing anyway, and the next 48 hours become an exercise in explaining away the drama. That's the recurring script people keep noticing. White creates a moment of tension, whether intentional or not. Clark answers through her play, and then both sides are left doing damage control while the clips keep circulating. At a certain point, repetition becomes perception. And perception, especially in a season this closely watched,
I mean, look, it's about finding ways, and we found a way, and get a couple of defensive stops, a couple of buckets.
Fast forward to late July, Fever versus Storm. Another game, another revealing sideline moment. A call goes against Indiana near midcourt, and Clark immediately turns toward the bench signaling for a challenge. She sees it clearly. She wants the review. She understands the moment. But instead of a quick reaction from the head coach, White appears hesitant, almost frozen, for a few critical beats while time is slipping away. So what does Clark do? She doesn't just stand there and hope. She walks straight toward an assistant coach to make sure someone is pushing the issue before the challenge window disappears. Indiana eventually does request the review. The call gets overturned. The ball comes back to the Fever. But the important part isn't only the result. It's who had to force the result into existence. That moment told a lot of people exactly what they already suspected. Clark does not always seem fully confident that her own sideline will act with the same urgency she sees on the floor. So she ends up advocating for her own team's interests in real time, almost like she has to manage the game from two directions at once, against the opponent, and then back toward the bench. That's not how the cleanest coach-star relationships usually look. In the best versions of those partnerships, the player and coach are in rhythm. The player signals, the coach trusts. The coach speaks, the player receives. There's clarity. There's instinctive cooperation. There's an understanding that both people are reading the same game. With White and Clark, too many of these moments feel delayed, strained, or visibly contested. Even when the right decision is eventually made, the path to that decision looks unnecessarily messy. And that's what people latch onto. It isn't just whether the challenge was won. It's whether Clark had to fight to get it used in the first place. Once that image is added to the earlier timeout argument, the public benching, and the repeated cleanup afterward, it starts looking less like random noise and more like a pattern of mistrust playing out in tiny bursts across the season. Not always dramatic. Not always explosive.
Can we please stop talking about Caitlin Clark so much? Oh, I'm sorry. Should we just ignore her when she casually drops 45 points and 10 assists in 29 minutes?
Then there's the media side of all this, which may be the most revealing layer of the entire story. Back in May, after a comeback win over the Washington Mystics, a game fueled in large part by Clark taking over in the fourth quarter, a reporter asked White directly what she thought about that individual performance. And instead of simply saying Clark's name and giving her a clear piece of credit, White pivoted immediately into team language. The answer became about the group showing resilience, about shot making, about time and score execution, about everyone staying together. All perfectly fine basketball concepts. But none of them actually answered the question that had been asked. That omission stood out because rival coaches have had no trouble identifying Clark directly when discussing what scares them. Fernandez from Dallas didn't dance around it. He didn't bury her impact under generic language. He said she was so good that his staff designed the entire defense around getting the ball out of her hands. Clean. Direct. Specific. So when Clark's own head coach seems either unable or unwilling to offer the same level of public specificity, fans notice. And once fans notice it, every other clip starts looking more charged. Another sideline exchange. Another moment where Clark appears frustrated. Another sequence where she seems to be hearing live correction while pushing through a difficult stretch. There's even that circulating clip where Clark is visibly irritated in-game, essentially telling the coaching staff she is already going full speed and doing everything she can while still hearing more instructions about positioning. That's what keeps this from being dismissed as simple overanalysis. The same dynamic keeps appearing in slightly different forms. Clark is trying to battle through the moment on her own terms, and White is still in her ear, still tightening the reins, still treating the situation like it needs immediate correction from above. Now place that next to the Dallas quote one more time. Fernandez wasn't reacting in panic mid-possession. He wasn't using the game itself to teach his team that Clark mattered. He handled that in advance. In the film room. In the prep. In the structure of the plan. That is proactive respect. It says, we know exactly what she is, and we are not foolish enough to let her play freely. White's viral moments, by comparison, often feel reactive. They feel like frustration surfacing live in public, directed at the very player carrying the largest creative burden on the roster. And then came another sequence that only fueled the same perception. In a late-game situation, Clark appeared to expect one action, one red, one play call, something she seemed sure had already been established. Instead, the ball went elsewhere, the possession broke down, and fans immediately read her facial expression as total disbelief. Hands up. Confusion. A look that seemed to say, what are we doing? Whether that was a miscommunication, a late audible, or just a botched possession, the bigger story was the same. Clark looked like a star guard who no longer fully trusted that the message from the sideline would match the moment on the floor. And none of this exists in a vacuum. Clark has dealt with physical wear, back issues, and non-stop scrutiny all season. Through all of that, she has still taken the public high road, condemning hostility, trying to cool the noise, and keeping the focus on basketball. That only makes the coaching disconnect feel more avoidable, because the player at the center of it keeps trying to stabilize the environment even while the visible sideline moments keep suggesting, here's the bigger picture, and honestly, it's the most frustrating part of this entire storyline for anyone who actually watches this league closely. Clark already gets dragged through the hottest of hot take cycles. Every week it's something new, her defense, her turnovers, whether she deserves this much attention, whether the spotlight should belong more fully to somebody else. She gets analyzed like a superstar and doubted like a newcomer at the exact same time. So when a coach from a rival team, with absolutely zero incentive to flatter her after beating her, sits down and says, in plain language, she's so good, as the literal reason his whole defensive scheme existed that night, that matters. That is not fan exaggeration. That is not podcast beef. That is not a social media account farming engagement. That is a working head coach telling you what the league actually fears. And that's why the comparison with Stephanie White keeps getting harsher every time another clip surfaces. Not because White is some awful coach, she isn't. She has won games. She has produced real results. She clearly knows basketball. But this is not just about whether she can coach. It's about how the relationship with her franchise player looks in public, and what that public image says about trust. There's another sideline clip fans keep replaying where Clark looks visibly exhausted by whatever White is saying, almost physically recoiling from it, before White calls her back in to keep the conversation going. Maybe that moment was harmless in context. Maybe it wasn't nearly as dramatic as it looked. But perception has momentum now, and once momentum builds, every clip gets filtered through the same question. Why does this keep looking adversarial? That's why the Dallas quote hit such a nerve. Because in one short answer, Fernandez gave Clark the kind of clear, undeniable respect that cuts through every lazy narrative floating around her. He spoke about her like a player you must scheme for, trap, redirect, and survive. He spoke about her like a first-order problem. Like the kind of guard who can ruin a game before it ever fully settles in. Meanwhile, her own coach has too often looked like someone still trying to win an argument with her instead of fully building around what the rest of the league already knows she is. And once fans lock onto that contrast, they don't let it go. That's why the Portland argument keeps resurfacing. That's why the Washington non-answer keeps coming back. That's why every sideline clip gets instantly attached to the bigger pattern. Because at some point, the evidence stops coming only from emotional fan reactions and starts coming straight from opposing coaches, game plans, and repeated public interactions. Whether White eventually starts giving Clark that same level of direct, specific public credit is something worth watching as the playoffs get closer. But for one press conference this week, it took a Dallas Wings coach to say out loud what people paying real attention to this league had already figured out. Caitlin Clark is not merely popular, not merely polarizing, and not merely marketable. She is important enough to warp game plans. Dangerous enough to dominate preparation. And respected enough by the opposition that the rest of Indiana's situation now looks even more confusing by comparison.